Good morning to you. My name is Steve Aram. I'm an elder in the Northern Illinois Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I'm speaking to you from my retirement home in Glen Ellen. And I'm thankful that Pastor Jonathan gave me this invitation to share with you this morning, and I'm glad to do that. Now, I imagine we probably all have a favorite book of the Bible. The Gospels should be high on everyone's list because they tell us the story of Jesus. And when we focus on Jesus, things go well in the church. When we lose sight of Jesus, things go badly. Some of us might have a favorite of the book of Romans, good theology. Probably many of us would pick the Psalms as our favorite book of the Bible, because when you're wrestling with something deep down inside and you can't quite put it into words, you start going through the Psalms and you can often find a prayer that's just right for sorting things out for you. Well, this morning, I want us to look at a book of the Bible that probably isn't on anybody's list of favorites. It's the book of Ruth. Have you ever read it, even once? Do you know where it is? It's really short, just 4 chapters. It's an easy read. To find it, in the Old Testament, it starts with the 5 books of the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then there's a whole bunch of books we call the history books, and it's Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. So it's the 8th book in the Bible. It's a little book, but I'll show you several reasons why we should know about it. For one thing, Ruth is just a really nice short story. It's great literature. It has tragedy. It has redemption. It has romance. The romance has some exotic twists to it as Ruth finds love in a culture that's very different from ours. If you like short stories, Ruth is a good read. And let me introduce you to it. And I'll read just the first 9 verses. And while I'm reading, listen to where the story begins. What's the setting? Where did this happen? So here it is. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. Where does the story start? In Bethlehem. That's where Jesus was born. What a coincidence. Or is it a coincidence? We'll come back to that in the end. And you heard the tragedy. It went by fast, but I hope you heard it. There was a famine in Israel, and that's a tragedy all by itself. Elimelech was desperate to feed his family. I could picture him using up all of his money. And then when there was nothing left for him in Bethlehem, he packed up his wife and his 2 sons, and he moved from his hometown of Bethlehem to the land of the Moabites, their ancient enemies, hostile territory. They came into town with nothing but what they could carry. They had no house to go to, no land, not much hope of mercy from those Moabites. They were probably part of a whole wave of desperate, hungry Israelites. And I can imagine the locals complaining, oh, look, it's more of those Israelites. Don't let them get comfortable here. How did they expect to support themselves? Why don't they just go back to where they came from? What do we call people who run into tragedies? And they just have to pack up and leave home and hope for refuge someplace else. You know, we call them refugees. And the Bible has a number of refugee stories. Jacob faced famine in Israel and had to move his family to Egypt. Mary and Joseph faced the violence of Herod's attempt to kill their baby and went to Egypt for refuge. But refugees aren't only in ancient history. My wife Kathy and I have informally adopted, through World Relief, a refugee family who came out of the Rwandan genocide. It was a horrible civil war between Hutu and Tutsi tribes. When the father of this family was a young man, he was staying with his grandfather, and men came into his grandfather's hut, and they crushed his grandfather's skull right in front of him. He took off, got away, hid in the bush until they quit looking for him. And then somehow he made his way hundreds of miles to a refugee camp in Mozambique. And I tried to look up how many miles this might be, and I went to Google Maps and I said, give me the route from Rwanda to Mozambique, and Google Maps said there isn't one. And probably there's back roads, so I don't know how he traveled hundreds of miles. As far as he knows, his entire family was wiped out. Nobody knows the total, but it could be up to 1 million people who were killed before the fighting stopped. In the refugee camp, he had to learn a new language. They speak Portuguese in Mozambique. He found a job with a farmer outside the camp. He found a nice young woman, also a refugee, and they married. They lived in a mud hut. They had to walk 20 minutes to the closest water tap, and that water was unsanitary. They had to use public pit toilets. That was their life for 2 decades, but they started a family. They made the best of it. What did they do wrong that all this tragedy came to them? Nothing. And I have been just awed getting to know them at their resilience and the hard work as they've been making it as a family in the United States now. 4 years ago, their application for refugee status in America came through, and they were some of the very few who were admitted to the U.S. Now, the husband works 1 full-time job during the day, Then 4 more hours in an evening second job. The wife is raising their 4 kids at home. Plus, when her brother went through a crisis, they took in her brother's baby as a foster child. And besides raising 5 kids, the wife is taking GED classes online. She is determined to get her GED degree. And for a while, she was working a part-time job on top of raising 5 kids and taking GED classes. The kids are doing well in school. They're really determined to move out of their subsidized apartment and buy a real house of their own. And their resilience and hard work and character are just amazing to me. I've enriched to have met them. Why do people pack up and leave their homes? Some are running away from violence. Some are running from famine, like Elimelech and Naomi. Some of my ancestors were religious minorities in Great Britain when there was not religious toleration. Some were Quakers, some were Puritans, some went to jail for their faith. And they left everything to come to the early colonies where they could be free to worship God in the best way they knew how. I'm a descendant of refugees many years ago. Some of Kathy's German ancestors were caught in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1800s and came to America to escape the bloodshed. Today we find huge numbers of refugees on our southern border. Why did they pack up and leave home? Many came from the countryside where their homes and farms were wiped out by hurricanes. Others had faced drought, and you can't raise crops without water. Others lived in the city and horrible government corruption and drug gangs. They left them with the choice of staying in the city where their kids would be murdered or pulled into these horrible gangs, or take what they could and take that long journey and take that long chance of getting into America and having a good life. What would you do if you were in their shoes? And you want to guess how many refugees there are in the world today? People who had to leave everything and move to a foreign country? About 20 million. That's the whole population of Illinois plus the whole population of Indiana combined. They come from Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Libya, Sudan. Those are the major ones, but it goes on and on. Why should we read a little book like Ruth? Let it remind us that human families face real tragedies. Let it remind us that God cares. So what happened to Elimelech and Naomi in Moab? They made the best of it. In time, their 2 sons married Moabite girls. But the tragedy continued because Elimelech died. I just wonder, did he work himself to death trying to get out of the hole? Their 2 sons died. And so Naomi, who had suffered the loss of her hometown, suffered the loss of her husband, suffered the loss of 1 son, suffered the loss of her last son. And the story continues with 3 widows now, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. Now they don't have any husbands to provide for them. And that would be horrible in our culture, but it was way more dangerous then. Those two Moabite girls are famous now. One was named Orpah, and she's famous because about 65 years ago, a desperately poor, single teenage mother in rural Mississippi decided that she was going to name her daughter after Orpah. Why? I don't know. And then it got misspelled, and her daughter became the famous Oprah Winfrey. Her name comes from this book. But more important than Oprah Winfrey is Naomi's other Moabite daughter-in-law, Ruth. When Naomi decided she had to go back home to Bethlehem, she told her daughters-in-law, "You stay in Moab. It's your only chance to find husbands here who will care for you." The story continues now in verse 16, and I'll read it for you. But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." In her own personal tragedy of losing her husband, this young Moabite woman was loyal to her mother-in-law. She traveled to Bethlehem, a place she'd never been before in a foreign country. There she went out every day during the harvest time to glean so they would have something to eat. And gleaning means that she would go behind the proper reapers, and wherever they missed a few grains, the gleaners would pick them up. And it was hard work. And a young single woman out alone in the fields with the workers could be very vulnerable. Let me broaden our focus for a moment from just refugees to all immigrants. And let's think about the hard work that so many of them do. As I was writing this in my home yesterday, there was a Mexican man mowing the lawn of our neighbor across the street in front of our house. And there were Mexicans installing siding on the house behind us. When you buy fruits or vegetables in the market, in the grocery store, probably immigrants pick them for us. When you buy meat, it was probably slaughtered and packed by immigrants. I had knee replacement surgery at Swedish American Hospital in Rockford about 10 years ago. I had nurses from Bosnia and Morocco. When you see an immigrant working here in the United States, especially those in hard and difficult jobs, think of Ruth in the Bible. But there's still one more person in Ruth's story that we need to meet, and his name is Boaz. Boaz was a farmer in Bethlehem. It sounds like he was doing pretty well because he had hired hands working for him. And he noticed this foreign woman who was working so hard, following his reapers in the field to support her mother-in-law. Actually, Boaz was some sort of relative to Naomi, and he should have been helping her in the first place. It wasn't long before Boaz told his workers to make a point of leaving some grain for Ruth to pick up. And the more he watched Ruth, the more he was impressed by her. One day he just took a bunch of the grain his workers had harvested and just gave it to her. I know that the problem of refugees in this world is huge and complicated for people smarter than I am. But this world needs a whole lot of people like Boaz who will see refugees, really see them, and do what they can to help. You can follow the news. We can pray. You can keep refugees in mind when you make your decisions about voting. You can support agencies like UNCOR and World Relief, who can be there in many countries of the world on the ground in refugee camps. We've found several ways to be directly involved with refugees here near Chicago. There may be opportunities there in DeKalb. Ask Pastor Jonathan when he gets back. I bet he will be an excellent resource. I told you that Ruth is a great story, and a great story really ought to have a happy ending. Boaz was so impressed with Ruth's character and loyalty and hard work that he married her. They had a son named Obed. Years went by. Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had several sons, and one of Jesse's sons became the greatest king of Israel, King David. What a contribution Ruth made. But that's not the end of it. Many more generations went by, and centuries later, another couple had a baby in Bethlehem. And they laid him in a manger, and they named him Jesus, for he would save his people from their sins. Jesus was a descendant of a Moabite refugee named Ruth. How many descendants of refugees and immigrants are making great contributions in our country? Wait a minute, is there anybody listening to me who isn't a descendant of someone who immigrated to the United States? If you aren't Native American, you are the descendant of an immigrant, perhaps a refugee. Now, like I said, the problems of refugees and immigration are too big and too complicated for me to give you easy, practical solutions. We can't just open the border and let everyone in all at once. But that doesn't mean there's nothing for us to do. And to start, nothing's going to get any better until we learn to see immigrants and refugees as real, flesh and blood human beings. Just that is a start. Sure, they come from other countries. They crossed our border. But when the Lord looks down from heaven, does he even see these artificial national boundaries that are such a big deal to us? I don't think they mean anything to God looking down. Sure, many of them have darker skin than most of us have, but the Lord looks at the heart. And I don't think its skin color means anything to him at all, nor should it to us. You've probably heard the story of a little boy walking along an ocean beach one morning. There had been quite a storm the night before, and thousands of starfish had been thrown up on the sand out of the water and would soon die as the sun got hot. The little boy was picking them up and throwing them back into the water. A man watched him for a few minutes and then said to the little boy, "You're wasting your time. Look, there's so many. You can't make any difference." The little boy just kept going. He threw the next starfish back into the water, and he said to the man, "You made a difference to that one." That's the wisdom of a child. And in closing, I'd like us to remember back to our childhoods, to that wonderful song that many of us sang in Sunday school. I won't ask how many years ago. I'll try to sing it for you. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world.